At a family gathering to divide the inheritance, my parents stunned me by giving the entire $5 million to my sister and telling me to work harder. But then, my grandpa stood up and shocked everyone by handing me a $55 million check. My mom screamed, "You can't do this to me." What grandpa said next left her speechless. Can you imagine discovering your entire life was a carefully constructed lie? I'm Amanda Blake, 32, and I witnessed my own family's implosion right there in the mahogany-paneled library of our family estate. The lawyer had just casually announced that my parents, Richard and Diane, had secretly funneled $5 million, money meant for all of us siblings, straight to my younger sister, Jillian. My breath literally hitched. But then, Grandpa Harold, the man everyone thought was bedridden and barely lucid, suddenly pushed himself up from his wheelchair. His eyes, which had been so cloudy for so long, were clear and razor-sharp. He looked right at my father and said 7 words that froze the blood in my veins. "I know exactly what you've been doing." In that moment, it wasn't just the inheritance that shattered, it was my entire childhood. Every memory, every assumption, every truth, it all came crashing down. This family betrayal fundamentally changed everything I understood about loyalty. And honestly, I'm still processing how one single moment could completely rewrite our entire family dynamic. If you've ever felt that sting of being betrayed by your own blood, trust me, karma came for them in the most unexpected and incredibly satisfying way. To truly grasp the magnitude of what unfolded that day, you need to know a bit about the Blake family. We weren't just rich, we were Connecticut old money. The kind of privilege that screams generations of ingrained financial security. My parents, Richard and Diane, ruled our household like benevolent dictators, always reminding us how incredibly fortunate we were to be born into such prosperity. There were 5 of us, my father, Richard, a calculating businessman with a Harvard MBA, every bit as sharp and cold as that sounds. My mother, Diane, the picture of a perfect socialite who managed our family's public image with military-grade precision. My brother Ethan, for years younger than me, was the designated family rebel. He really just wanted to play music. Then there was Jillian, the baby of the family at 25. And finally me, Amanda, the eldest at 32. From my earliest memories, Jillian was just different. The moment she was born, the whole dynamic in our house noticeably shifted. I had my baby pictures tucked away in simple albums in the attic. Jillian? Oh no, she had professional portraits adorning our main hallway. Her birthday parties were these extravagant, over-the-top affairs with petting zoos and professional entertainers. Mine? Simple gatherings, a few friends from school. And it just kept going as we grew up. "Jillian has your father's business instinct," my mother would constantly say. This, mind you, was despite Jillian showing zero interest in anything beyond social media and shopping until much, much later. Meanwhile, I was out there, graduating summa cum laude, actively pursuing every business course I could, all with one goal: to join Blake Real Estate Holdings, the company my incredible Grandpa Harold had literally built from nothing. Grandpa Harold was my absolute refuge in that family. While my parents would drag themselves to Ethan's rock band performances out of pure obligation, and then light up with genuine enthusiasm for Jillian's ballet recitals, Grandpa was always there for me. Front row. My debate competitions. My business school presentations. He saw something in me that my parents just seemed determined to ignore. "You remind me of myself at your age," he told me once, as we walked the sprawling grounds of Lakeview Manor, our family estate overlooking the Connecticut shoreline. "You've got the hunger to build something, Amanda, not just inherit it." Grandpa Harold's story was legendary, truly. He started with a single rundown apartment building back in the 1960s and slowly, painstakingly, expanded it into luxury properties all across New England. By the time he handed the day-to-day operations to my father 15 years ago, Blake Real Estate Holdings was worth over $100 million. I worshipped him, honestly. My father, he was all about maintaining what was already there. Grandpa Harold? He was a visionary. He taught me that wealth isn't just about accumulating, it's about creating value where none existed before. The dismissal of my business ambitions only grew louder after I graduated from Wharton. Despite my actual qualifications, my father gave me this minor role, managing a tiny division of rental properties. Not the development position I'd been working towards my entire life. "Property management will be good experience," he said, in that incredibly patronizing way he had. "Development requires a certain instinct that can't be taught in school." The irony, the sheer audacity of it all, was that Jillian, who had barely scraped by in her business classes at a state university, was immediately handed a vice president title and direct access to major development projects right after her graduation. The favoritism couldn't have been more glaringly obvious. Then I met David in my late 20s. He gave me a perspective my suffocating family bubble had never allowed. He's this dedicated high school English teacher, passionate about literature, and he saw right through the Blake family dynamics. "They're grooming Jillian for something," he observed after just our third family dinner together. "And they're deliberately sidelining you." I actually defended my parents at first. Made excuses. Oh, Jillian needs more support, or maybe they see something in her that I can't. But deep down, I knew David was absolutely right. The question just gnawed at me. Why? Why would my parents so blatantly favor their youngest child when I had done everything perfectly? When David proposed, my parents' reaction was, to put it mildly, tepid. My mother arranged this incredibly modest engagement dinner at the country club. Nothing, absolutely nothing, like the lavish extravaganza I knew would have been planned if Jillian had gotten engaged to someone from their elite social circle. A teacher, really, Amanda, my mother had actually whispered when she thought I couldn't hear her, speaking to my father. She could have had her pick of the Ashton boy or the Winthrop heir. David and I got married anyway. We bought a modest colonial home, a comfortable 30 minutes from Lakeview Manor. I kept working for the family business, desperately trying to prove my worth, even with the invisible glass ceiling my parents had so carefully installed above me. Jillian, meanwhile, just flitted from department to department, collecting praise for the most basic accomplishments. My successes? They were just expected. Ethan, on the other hand, wanted zero to do with real estate. He pursued music with a passion that both irritated and, frankly, relieved our parents. Irritated, because it wasn't the traditional path they'd envisioned for their son. Relieved, because it meant he wasn't competing for control of the family empire. That battle, it seemed, was solely, unfairly, between Jillian and me. But through all of it, Grandpa Harold remained my steadfast champion. He'd invite me to lunch all the time, asking these sharp, pointed questions about the business, always nodding approvingly at my observations. As I entered my 30s, I started to hope, foolishly, perhaps, that when the time finally came for the next leadership transition, his influence might just tip the scales in my favor, despite my parents' incredibly obvious preference for Jillian. Little did I know a far more complex, sinister game was being played behind the scenes. A game that would eventually expose the rotten core, the absolute rot, at the very heart of the Blake family fortune. 2 years before our world imploded, Grandpa Harold started to decline. Slowly at first. Forgetting names, misplacing his glasses, telling the same story twice in an afternoon. He was 84, so no one was that alarmed. Age catches up with everyone, they'd say. But by the next spring, his decline sped up dramatically. He moved from his wing of Lakeview Manor into this specially outfitted medical suite. A full-time nurse was hired. Family visits became scheduled, almost clinical, instead of casual drop-ins. Despite my increasingly demanding work schedule, I made it a point to visit Grandpa at least twice a week. I'd bring him fresh flowers, sit by his bed, and just talk. I'd update him on the business, even though my parents kept insisting he couldn't follow complex conversations anymore. "He finds comfort in your voice," my mother would say, dismissively. "But don't bother him with business matters. Dr. Reynolds says stress could worsen his condition." But there were these moments, during those visits, when I swore Grandpa was more lucid than everyone claimed. His eyes would sharpen when I mentioned specific properties or deals. He'd ask surprisingly precise questions before slipping back into those vague pleasantries. I actually brought it up to my father once. He just dismissed it as sundowning, temporary periods of clarity, common in dementia patients. But I knew deep down it was more than that. As Grandpa's health apparently worsened, I started seeing massive shifts in the family business. My father began restructuring departments, moving long-trusted employees to different positions, even bringing in new executives from outside, something the Blakes never did. When I dared to question these moves in management meetings, I was told they were preparing for the future and that the changes had Grandpa Harold's blessing. But what really got me were the closed-door meetings between my parents and Lawrence Peterson, our family's longtime attorney. 3 times I arrived at Lakeview Manor to visit Grandpa, only to find Peterson slipping out of the study with stacks of folders. When I asked my mother about it, she'd just vaguely mumble about estate planning and ensuring a smooth transition. And then, around this exact time, Jillian suddenly developed this incredibly intense interest in the family business. After years of treating her VP title as nothing more than an excuse for a fancy corner office and a company credit card, she was suddenly at every meeting, taking meticulous notes, spending time with the financial officers. The transformation was jarring, genuinely. "I've realized how important Grandpa's legacy is," she told me over lunch one day, her voice dripping with this almost sickeningly false sincerity. "Dad's been mentoring me privately. He says I have a natural talent for the big picture stuff." I tried discussing my creeping concerns with Ethan during one of his rare visits home from LA, where he was trying to get his band signed. "Something just feels off about all of this," I told him, as we shared a bottle of wine on my terrace. "Dad's making huge company changes without proper consultation. Jillian's suddenly acting like she's next in line, and they're limiting access to Grandpa Harold." Ethan just shrugged, twirling his wine glass. You're being paranoid, Mandy. Dad's always been a control freak, and Jillian's just trying to impress them as usual. As for Grandpa, he's old and sick. It sucks, but it's not some conspiracy. But my suspicions only intensified. Especially after I accidentally stumbled upon some documents in my father's office. I swear, I wasn't trying to snoop, I was just looking for quarterly reports. But there it was, a folder labeled Succession Planning, Confidential, sitting wide open on his desk. Inside? Draft documents transferring massive assets from Grandpa Harold's personal holdings directly to Jillian, completely bypassing Ethan and me. When my father found me looking, his face flushed, a dark red with anger. Those are private family matters, Amanda, he snapped, snatching the folder from my hands. Private family matters that apparently don't include me? I countered, my voice shakier than I intended. Your grandfather and I have made decisions based on what's best for the company's future, he said, his voice now chillingly cold. Not everyone has the right temperament for wealth management. The conversation ended there, but the tension between us just simmered, growing thicker in the following months. I started documenting everything, changes in company structure, unusual financial movements, the precise timing of my parents' meetings with Peterson. David thought I was becoming obsessive, but something deep in my gut screamed that what was happening wasn't right. Not at all. That last Christmas, right before the will reading, was particularly unsettling. We gathered at Lakeview Manor, as always, with Grandpa Harold brought downstairs for the traditional gift exchange. He seemed so foggy that evening, barely recognizing Ethan, and actually calling Jillian by my name several times. Yet, when everyone else was distracted by dessert, I could have sworn I saw him watching my father with an expression that was anything but confused. It was calculating. As we were leaving that night, Jillian pulled me aside with this suddenly, unusually sisterly affection. You should really start thinking about your future beyond Blake Holdings, she purred, squeezing my arm. You and David could move anywhere with your business degree. Haven't you ever wanted to try something completely different? The warning couldn't have been clearer if she'd spelled it out in flashing neon lights. They were planning to push me out, and they wanted me to go quietly. Oh, how little they knew that the upcoming reading of Grandpa Harold's will would absolutely upend all their careful, conniving plans in ways none of us could have possibly imagined. The day of Grandpa Harold's will reading dawned bright and clear, a crisp autumn morning that should have lifted my spirits. Instead, it felt ominous. David squeezed my hand, a silent reassurance as we drove through the ornate gates of Lakeview Manor. Neither of us dared speak the fear aloud that today would officially mark my complete exclusion from the family business and possibly from the family fortune entirely. Whatever happens, David said, as we parked beside my father's gleaming Bentley, we have each other, and we have a good life, regardless of what your parents decide. The grand library of Lakeview Manor had always been my favorite room. 2 stories of leather-bound books, a massive stone fireplace, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. It was an atmosphere of timeless elegance. Today, though, the room felt utterly suffocating. My father stood by the fireplace, looking imperial in a tailored charcoal suit. My mother perched on a leather wingback chair, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her expression appropriately somber. Jillian sat nearby, dressed in an expensive black dress that screamed calculated mourning, despite the fact that Grandpa Harold was very much alive, just unwell. Grandpa himself was there, which actually surprised me. Wheeled in by his nurse, he sat slumped in a specialized wheelchair, a plaid blanket across his knees despite the room's warmth. His once commanding presence had shrunk so drastically it made my heart ache. He barely seemed to register the significance of the gathering. Ethan arrived last, looking incredibly uncomfortable in a suit that clearly didn't fit his musician's frame. He gave me a quick hug, a fleeting moment of solidarity, before taking a seat as far from our parents as he possibly could. Lawrence Peterson, the lawyer, cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Thank you all for gathering today, Peterson began, his voice perfectly modulated. As you know, Harold has decided, given his health situation, to execute certain aspects of his estate plan now, rather than waiting. He believes this will ensure a smoother transition and allow him to see his wishes fulfilled during his lifetime. Peterson droned on, reading through standard legal provisions, executive appointments, tax considerations, charitable bequests to Grandpa Harold's favorite organizations. I listened, every nerve on edge, waiting for the details that would directly impact the family business. Regarding Blake Real Estate Holdings, Peterson continued, Harold has already transferred operational control to Richard, as you all know. However, ownership shares were to be distributed upon Harold's passing according to the following percentages: 40% to Richard, 20% to Amanda, 20% to Ethan, and 20% to Jillian. My heart actually lifted slightly at that word, were. At least Grandpa had initially intended for US to share equally in the business. A tiny flicker of hope. However, Peterson said, adjusting his glasses again, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in his tone. As part of Harold's revised estate plan, executed 3 months ago, when he transferred power of attorney to Richard, a significant distribution has already taken place. Peterson lifted a document from his portfolio. Harold has gifted Jillian Blake $5 million in liquid assets and real estate holdings, including the Westbrook development, the Sheffield apartment complex, and the Newport vacation property. The room began to spin. $5 million. And those weren't just any properties. Those were the exact properties I had been managing for the past 5 years. Properties that were supposed to be divided among all the grandchildren. The Westbrook development wasn't even completed yet. It was the project I had poured my heart and soul into, researching environmental impact, working with local officials, designing a mixed-use community that would provide both luxury and affordable housing. These assets, Peterson continued, his voice monotone, have been removed from the estate distribution and are now solely owned by Jillian Blake. That's not possible, I managed, my voice sounding distant, foreign even to my own ears. Those properties were specifically mentioned in Grandpa's original estate plan as being divided among all of us. My father stepped forward, his expression a perfectly practiced blend of fake sympathy and cold firmness. Amanda, your grandfather, and I discussed this at length. The reality is that Jillian has demonstrated exceptional business acumen over the past year. Furthermore, with you and David both having established careers, and Ethan pursuing his music, Jillian simply has greater financial needs at this stage. Greater financial needs? Ethan repeated, incredulously, finally snapping out of his daze. She lives in a company-paid penthouse and has never worked a day in her life outside the cushy job you gave her. Jillian's face flushed with anger. That's not fair. I've been working closely with Dad on major projects. Just because I don't broadcast every little accomplishment like Amanda doesn't mean I haven't earned this. Earned? I couldn't help but let out a short, sharp laugh, though there was zero humor in it. Jillian, you couldn't even explain how a cap rate works last year, and suddenly you've earned $5 million in assets? My mother immediately jumped in, her voice carrying that exact warning tone I'd heard throughout my entire childhood. Amanda, this is exactly the kind of reaction that concerned your grandfather. This competitiveness, this inability to be happy for your sister's success. Success? I stood up, blood pounding in my ears, hot and furious. What success? What has she actually accomplished besides being your favorite? Peterson awkwardly shuffled his papers. Perhaps we should take a brief recess, no? I interrupted, moving directly toward his desk. I want to see the transfer documents now. After a moment's hesitation and a subtle nod from my father, Peterson handed me the paperwork. There it was, in black and white, my father's signature as power of attorney, authorizing the transfer of assets that had been meant for all of us to Jillian alone. The date on the document coincided perfectly with the period when Grandpa Harold's health had supposedly taken a dramatic turn for the worse. This is wrong, I said quietly, scanning the pages, my voice barely a whisper. Grandpa would never have wanted this. He believed in fairness. People change their minds, Amanda, my father said, so smoothly, too smoothly. Especially when they see who truly values the family legacy versus who might be distracted by outside interests. He glanced meaningfully at David, a subtle jab. The injustice of it all was a physical blow. Years of hard work, dismissed. My dedication to the company, treated like a hobby. Assets I had managed successfully, handed to my sister, who had shown no real interest until recently. It was utterly overwhelming. I felt tears pricking at my eyes, threatening to spill, and I fought them back with every ounce of strength I had. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Not now. Not ever. And then, just then, it happened. From his wheelchair in the corner, Grandpa Harold slowly, deliberately, pushed the blanket off his knees. With effort, yes, but with a surprising, absolute steadiness, he rose to his feet. His nurse gasped, starting towards him, but he waved her away with a firm, dismissive hand. That's enough, he said. His voice. Oh my God, his voice was stronger, clearer, than I had heard it in over a year. The room fell absolutely silent. My father's face strained of all color, turning ashen. Dad, you shouldn't be exerting yourself, he stammered, quickly. Let's get you back to your room where you can rest. Grandpa Harold fixed my father with a stare that could have frozen fire. I've been watching you all very carefully. He paused, letting his words sink in. The will you just heard, it's a fake. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. My mother's hand flew to her pearl necklace, that nervous habit from childhood, clutching it like a lifeline. Jillian looked like she might actually faint. My father stood perfectly still, like a predator who had just realized he was the one being hunted, desperately hoping to avoid detection. Mr. Blake, Peterson began cautiously. I assure you, these are the documents you signed. When I was supposedly suffering from dementia, Grandpa Harold interrupted, his voice gaining power, strength with each word. When I supposedly couldn't make decisions for myself. Richard, did you really think I wouldn't find out what you've been doing? My father started to speak, but Grandpa Harold simply raised his hand. Save it. I have proof of everything. The embezzlement, the falsified accounting, the offshore accounts, every last dirty deal you've made behind my back for the past decade. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small silver thumb drive, holding it up like a gleaming trophy. It's all here. And Judge Franklin has another copy in his safe. One phone call from me, and it all goes to the district attorney. My entire world was collapsing and rebuilding itself simultaneously. Grandpa Harold. My Grandpa Harold. He had been testing them. He had been testing us all along. And my parents had failed, spectacularly. The library erupted into chaos. My mother started sobbing, a dramatic, performative wail. My father tried to approach Grandpa Harold, only to be stopped dead in his tracks by a look so fierce it could have melted steel. Jillian sat frozen, her perfectly made-up face a mask of absolute shock. Ethan, bless him, moved to stand right beside me, our shoulders touching in a silent show of solidarity we hadn't shared since childhood. Everyone sit down, Grandpa Harold commanded. And remarkably, incredibly, everyone obeyed. Even my father, the man who had run our family and business with an iron fist, sank into the nearest chair like a thoroughly scolded child. I'll start from the beginning, Grandpa said, moving with this astonishing agility to take his traditional seat at the head of the long library table, his rightful place during family meetings. 14 months ago, I started noticing irregularities in the quarterly financial reports. Properties that should have been generating substantial income were showing minimal returns. Development costs for new projects were inexplicably inflated. Money was moving through our accounts in patterns that made absolutely no sense for legitimate business. He looked directly at my father, a piercing gaze. At first, Richard, I thought you were simply making poor decisions. But Thomas Franklin, you remember my old friend who became a judge? He suggested something far more concerning might be happening. My father's face went from pale to ashen. Judge Franklin, a friend of Grandpa's for over 50 years, was a known expert in financial crimes. Thomas put me in touch with a forensic accountant and a private investigator, Grandpa continued, his voice calm, yet devastating. What they uncovered was far, far worse than I imagined. Richard, you've been systematically draining assets from Blake Holdings for at least 8 years. Millions siphoned into shell companies and offshore accounts under various aliases. My mother finally found her voice, though it trembled. Was it emotion or calculation? Impossible to tell. Harold, you're confused. Richard has grown the company's official value. The annual reports clearly show. The annual reports show what Richard wanted them to show. Grandpa cut her off, sharp and final. The real numbers tell a very different story. We should be worth nearly twice what we are on paper. He turned to Peterson, who looked profoundly uncomfortable. Lawrence, I'm deeply disappointed in you. You had to have suspected something wasn't right with those documents I supposedly signed. Peterson swallowed hard. Mr. Blake, I was assured you were having lucid periods when major decisions were made. Given your medical reports that were exaggerated by specialists who mysteriously received large donations to their research foundations from anonymous sources, Grandpa raised an eyebrow, a chilling implication. Those medical reports. My mind was racing, connecting dots that had been floating disconnected for years. The restricted access to Grandpa, the new doctors, the sudden changes in company structure. You've been pretending all this time? I asked, still struggling to reconcile the sharp, strategic man before me with the foggy, confused grandfather I'd been visiting. Grandpa's expression softened as he looked at me. Not entirely pretending, Amanda. I am 84. I do have some cognitive challenges, but nothing like what they've led everyone to believe. He smiled slightly, a knowing, almost mischievous glint in his eyes. I've been careful to appear more impaired when certain people were watching. He turned back to my father, his gaze hardening. I needed to know how far you would go. Would you stop at cooking the books, or would you try to manipulate my final wishes, too? So, I created the perfect test. I pretended to decline more rapidly. I allowed you to think you had complete control. My father finally spoke, his businessman's composure partially restored, though a tremor still ran through his voice. Dad, this is ridiculous. I've made some aggressive tax maneuvers, certainly, but nothing illegal. As for the will, you and I discussed the changes. You agreed. Jillian showed promise. Richard, stop. Grandpa's voice was quiet, but it cut like a knife. The game is over. My investigator has documented transfers totaling $27 million to accounts that ultimately trace back to you and Diane. Not to the company. Not to family trusts. To your personal control. He nodded to his nurse, who left the room briefly and returned with a distinguished older man I didn't recognize. This is Michael Donovan, a former FBI financial crime specialist. He's been building the case for nearly a year. Donovan nodded professionally, his expression grim. We have transaction records, communication logs, and testimony from 3 former employees who were pressured to falsify documents. The evidence is conclusive. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was potentially criminal. Jillian suddenly burst into tears. Not the calculated, delicate tears she typically deployed when things didn't go her way, but ugly, gasping sobs, mascara streaming down her face. I didn't know, she wailed. I mean, I knew something wasn't right with some of the paperwork Dad had me sign, but he said it was just tax optimization. Grandpa Harold regarded her coolly, his gaze unflinching. You knew enough, Jillian. Those tax forms you signed authorized the transfer of assets out of the country. Your signature is on documents creating shell companies in the Caymans. She was just doing what I told her. My father interjected sharply, trying to protect her, perhaps. Leave her out of this. Like you left Amanda out? Grandpa countered, his voice dripping with ice. The only person who actually showed genuine business acumen and ethical judgment. The one you deliberately sidelined because she might have noticed what you were doing. Hearing this absolute validation from Grandpa, the confirmation that I hadn't imagined the years of being overlooked and undermined, it released something tight, something incredibly painful, in my chest. David reached for my hand under the table, a reassuring squeeze. The will you heard today is completely fabricated, Grandpa continued, his voice firm. My actual estate plan is quite different, and it remains unchanged from what I decided 5 years ago. He nodded to Donovan, who produced another folder of documents. Blake Holdings will be placed in a family trust, Grandpa explained. Amanda will serve as primary trustee, with Ethan as secondary trustee. Operational decisions will require approval from both trustees. Richard and Diane, you are removed from all leadership positions, effective immediately. My parents stared in stunned, horrified silence. My father's calculating mind was visibly racing. You could practically see the gears turning, searching for an angle, an escape route. You can't do this, he finally erupted. You legally transferred power of attorney to me. These new documents won't stand up in court. Power of attorney obtained through fraud and misrepresentation of my mental capacity? Grandpa smiled thinly, a chilling sight. Judge Franklin has already reviewed the evidence. The medical assessment I underwent last week, without your knowledge, confirms I am fully competent to make these decisions. He turned to Ethan and me, his expression softening slightly. There's one more thing you should know, and it may be the hardest truth of all. He took a deep, steadying breath. Richard is not my biological son. My entire understanding of our family history shattered like glass. Just imagine that. This was the ultimate bombshell, and it explained decades of strange dynamics, of resentment, of deception. This revelation changed everything about how I viewed my family, my legacy, my entire past. The silence that followed Grandpa Harold's announcement was deafening, a thick, suffocating blanket. My father sat completely still, his face utterly unreadable. My mother, though, she couldn't meet anyone's eyes. She just looked away, studying her manicured nails as if they held the secrets of the universe. What are you talking about? Ethan finally asked, his voice a strained, unusually quiet whisper. Grandpa Harold's expression held decades of contained pain. Your grandmother, Eleanor, and I had been married for 3 years without conceiving a child. We were going through testing to determine the cause when she suddenly announced she was pregnant. I was overjoyed, never questioning the timing. He paused, his gaze distant with memory, lost in the past. It was only after Eleanor died of cancer, when Richard was 17, that I found her journals. She had had a brief affair with my business partner, Charles Whitmore. Richard was the result. My father's jaw tightened, but he remained chillingly silent. I made the decision to keep this knowledge to myself, Grandpa continued, his voice heavy with the weight of that secret. Richard had already lost his mother. I couldn't bear to tell him I wasn't his biological father, especially since I had raised him and loved him as my own from the moment he was born. If you loved him so much, my mother interjected sharply, suddenly finding her voice, why reveal this painful secret now, in front of everyone? Grandpa's eyes hardened, steeling. Because Richard has used preserving the Blake family legacy as justification for every manipulative, underhanded action he's ever taken. He's wielded the Blake name like a weapon against his own children, favoring one over the others based on who he could more easily control. He looked directly at my father, a piercing, damning gaze. But the truth is, Richard, you've never understood what the Blake legacy truly means because you've never had to build anything yourself. My father finally spoke, his voice now deadly calm, controlled. So, this is your revenge? Announcing that I'm a bastard and cutting me out of the company I've run for 15 years. This isn't revenge, Richard. It's accountability, Grandpa replied, his voice firm. And I'm not cutting you out entirely. You and Diane will retain 15% ownership in the trust, providing income, but no management authority. The company will be led by Amanda and Ethan, with my guidance for as long as I'm able to provide it. And Jillian, my mother asked, pointedly, her desperation showing. Jillian will retain 10% ownership and her current role for a probationary period. Her future in the company will depend entirely on her choices moving forward. This is preposterous, my father declared, standing abruptly, his composure cracking. I'll contest this in court. I'll expose your mental decline. Please do, Grandpa interrupted, with unnerving calm. And I'll ensure the district attorney receives the complete file on your financial crimes. How do you think the Westbrook investors will react when they learn their money was partially diverted to your personal accounts in Grand Cayman? The threat hung in the air, its implications unmistakable, heavy. My father, for perhaps the first time in his entire adult life, had no countermove. We're going home to discuss our options, my mother announced, gathering her purse with trembling hands. Jillian, come with us. Jillian hesitated, her eyes starting between our parents and Grandpa Harold. Jillian, my mother repeated sharply. After a moment's agonizing hesitation, Jillian followed our parents from the room. The heavy library door closed behind them with a definitive thud, like the final period at the end of a long, complicated, and utterly devastating sentence. Dinner that evening was quite possibly the most excruciating experience of my entire life. Grandpa Harold, ever the strategist, had insisted we all stay at Lakeview Manor to begin the transition process. My parents and Jillian arrived. Last to the dining room, looking like they'd spent the entire afternoon in intense, private discussion, probably plotting their next move. The massive oak table, which could comfortably seat 24, now felt both too vast for our tiny, fractured group and too confining to contain the sheer, palpable tension radiating between us. We ate in near silence. The only sounds were the clink of silverware against fine china and the occasional, forced request to pass the salt or wine. Ethan kept shooting me these questioning, uncomfortable glances across the table. He was clearly as unsettled as I was. After the main course had been cleared, Grandpa Harold spoke. Tomorrow morning, we'll meet with the board to announce the leadership changes. Amanda, I'd like you to prepare a brief statement about your vision for the company moving forward. My father's knife clattered, loudly, against his dessert plate. This is still precipitous, Dad. The board has worked with me for years. They won't simply accept Amanda stepping in without question. They will, Grandpa replied evenly, his voice unwavering, when they understand the alternative is a public scandal and potential criminal charges. Most of them have their own investments tied up in Blake Holdings, Richard. They'll choose stability and discretion. Later that evening, Ethan found me in the garden gazebo. I'd retreated there to call David, just trying to process the absolute avalanche of revelations from the day. He sat beside me on the cushioned bench, looking up at the stars, visible through the gazebo's glass ceiling. So, he said after a long moment, apparently, we're business partners now. Despite everything, despite the enormity of it, I actually laughed. Apparently, I said. I know nothing about real estate development, he admitted. You know more than you think, and you have good instincts about people, which is half the battle, I told him, genuinely. I turned to look at him properly. Are you okay with all of this, Ethan? You've always been so clear about wanting your own path. Ethan was quiet for a moment, contemplating. I think. I'm actually relieved, he finally confessed. Music will always be my passion, Amanda. But I've been struggling in LA. Too many talented people, not enough opportunities. He shrugged, a slight smile forming. Maybe this is the universe telling me it's time for a different approach. I can still make music while helping with the family business. Co-trustees, I mused. Grandpa was smart to structure it that way. Neither of us can make major decisions alone. Checks and balances, Ethan agreed, a wry smile now. Something our parents never, ever allowed. The very next morning, Grandpa Harold invited me to his private study. This was a room I hadn't been permitted to enter for months. Unlike the grand, imposing library, this space was intimate, personal, filled with worn leather chairs and walls lined with family photographs, not imposing legal tomes. He unlocked an antique cabinet and removed a weathered photo album I'd never, ever seen before. As we sat together on his small sofa, he began showing me images from the early, raw days of Blake Holdings, construction sites, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, handshake deals, all captured in fading color. Your grandmother Eleanor was my heart, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, pointing to a beautiful woman with a warm smile standing beside him in front of their first major development. When I discovered her affair after her death, it nearly destroyed me. Not just the betrayal, but the fact that she'd taken the truth to her grave. Is that why you and Dad always seemed so strained? I asked, almost a whisper, even before the financial issues. Grandpa nodded slowly. I tried not to let it affect how I treated him, but perhaps some part of me was always looking for Eleanor's betrayal in Richard's face. And Richard, he always sensed something was missing between us, though he never knew why. He turned the page to reveal photos of my father as a young man, graduating from college, joining the family business. I should have told him the truth when he was old enough to understand. Secrets like this poison families across generations. Like the secret that my parents have been embezzling from the company? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Yes, Grandpa acknowledged, his gaze steady. Though I suspect that particular crime has a simpler motivation. Your father has expensive tastes, and your mother's family lost their money 2 generations ago. Her social status has always depended entirely on the Blake fortune. He closed the album gently, then looked at me, his eyes full of a profound sadness. But there's something else you need to understand, Amanda. Richard isn't biologically a Blake, but he is my son in every way that matters. I raised him, taught him, loved him. His actions are his own responsibility. But the distance between us, that's partially my failure. The complexity of family relationships had never felt so utterly profound. Grandpa Harold had kept a devastating secret for decades, all out of love. Yet that very secret had created this immense emotional gulf that perhaps drove my father to his own deceptions. It was a vicious cycle. What happens now? I asked quietly, feeling the weight of all these truths. Now we rebuild, Grandpa replied, his voice firm, resolute. The company, yes, but more importantly, the family. Or at least the parts that can be salvaged. Before I could even respond, there was a sharp, urgent knock at the study door. Ethan burst in, his expression troubled, panicked. You need to come downstairs, he said, urgently breathless. Dad's gone through Grandpa's office. He's destroying documents. The weeks following what our family would forever call the revelation were some of the most challenging of my entire life. My parents, predictably, declared all-out war, both legal and emotional. They moved out of Lakeview Manor the very next day after my father was caught shredding documents, setting up camp in their Manhattan penthouse and hiring Stanley Rothman, one of the most aggressive, cutthroat attorneys in New York. Grandpa Harold, bless his heart, temporarily moved in with David and me. While the legal situation slowly stabilized, our modest colonial suddenly felt both too small for his larger-than-life presence and, paradoxically, strangely more like home with him there. Drinking coffee at our kitchen table and sharing stories of his early days in real estate. The first salvo in my parents' legal offensive was a petition challenging Grandpa's mental competence. Despite the independent medical assessment confirming his capacity, they submitted affidavits from the specialists they had previously engaged, all painting a picture of Grandpa suffering from significant cognitive decline, with only occasional periods of lucidity. Judge Franklin, true to his deep friendship with Grandpa, ensured the case. Was assigned to Judge Rebecca Martinez, known for her no-nonsense approach to family disputes. She ordered a comprehensive evaluation by a court-appointed geriatric psychiatrist, who, thankfully, ultimately confirmed what we already knew. Grandpa Harold had some age-related memory issues, but was fundamentally sound in his decision-making capacity. With the competency challenge decisively defeated, my parents shifted tactics. Rothman filed for an emergency injunction to prevent any changes to the company leadership structure, claiming my father had been operating under a valid power of attorney and that the sudden reorganization would cause irreparable harm to Blake Holdings' business interests. Meanwhile, Jillian launched what could only be described as a full-blown social media smear campaign. Carefully worded posts about elder abuse and manipulative relatives taking advantage of my beloved grandfather started popping up on her Instagram and Facebook. She never named me directly, of course, but the implications were crystal clear to anyone who knew our family. Can you believe this? I asked David one evening, showing him Jillian's latest post, a throwback photo of her and Grandpa with the caption, "Some people will do anything for money and power, even turning family members against each other. Heartbroken, but staying strong for you, Grandpa." David set aside the essays he was grading, his expression darkening. She's playing the victim while your parents were the ones stealing millions. The irony is almost impressive. The toll on our marriage was subtle, but very real. David had always been my absolute rock, but the constant, relentless stress of legal proceedings, emergency business meetings, and nonstop family drama was testing both our patience and our relationship. Late nights poring over company financial records meant less time together. The emotional weight I carried home each day created a heaviness that was incredibly difficult to escape, even in our most intimate moments. "I'm so sorry," I whispered one night after snapping at him over something trivial, a forgotten grocery item, if I recall correctly. "I don't mean to bring all this home with me." "Hey," he said, pulling me gently into his arms. "For better or worse, remember? This is the worst part. We'll get through it. Together." Ethan, surprisingly, adapted to his new role in the company with incredible speed. While I focused on the nitty-gritty of operations and development, he took over investor relations and marketing, areas where his natural charisma and creativity proved unexpectedly invaluable. He moved back from Los Angeles, got an apartment near the office, and threw himself into learning the business with an enthusiasm I'd never seen him direct toward anything except music. Turns out I'm pretty good at this corporate stuff, he told me over lunch in the company cafeteria about a month after the revelation. Who knew? Explaining complex real estate investments to nervous investors isn't that different from convincing club owners to book an unknown band. His support became even more crucial when the court hearings began in earnest. The preliminary injunction had been denied, but my parents' attorney had filed a much more substantial lawsuit, challenging the new trust arrangement on multiple grounds. Each hearing meant more painful family secrets exposed in the sterile, unforgiving environment of the courthouse, with court reporters dispassionately transcribing every single agonizing detail. The wider community's reaction to the unfolding Blake family drama was completely mixed. Some longtime business associates distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the allegations of financial impropriety. Others, particularly those who had experienced my father's cutthroat business tactics firsthand, seemed almost vindicated by his downfall. Extended family members chose sides, of course, with most of my mother's relatives predictably supporting my parents, while Grandpa Harold's few surviving relatives rallied behind him. Holiday gatherings, once obligatory, if not particularly warm, were now completely fractured, marked by competing invitations and pointed absences. Through it all, Grandpa Harold maintained a dignity that was nothing short of remarkable. Despite the public airing of his wife's infidelity, his son's betrayal, and his own decision to conceal the truth for decades, he never showed embarrassment or resentment. He testified when required, answered questions honestly, and refused to engage in the kind of emotional mudslinging my parents had so eagerly embraced. The truth doesn't need embellishment or defensive anger, he told me one evening, as we reviewed case documents at my dining room table. It simply needs to be stated clearly and consistently. About 6 weeks into the legal proceedings, I was working late at the office when I received a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of a diary page, in my mother's distinctive handwriting, dated almost 30 years earlier. The entry read, "Harold cornered me today about the Westlake project numbers. He suspects something is off, but doesn't yet realize how deep it goes or how long Richard has been adjusting the books. I convinced him it was an accounting error. He trusts me still, though less than before. Richard says we need to accelerate the plan. I am afraid of what that means." The text message following the photo simply read, "There's more where this came from. Meet me at Riverside Park Bench near the 79th Street Boat Basin. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Come alone." I stared at my phone, my heart absolutely racing. This was evidence that the financial manipulation had been going on far longer than even Grandpa suspected. But it could also be a trap. A dangerous one. After consulting with our attorneys and Grandpa Harold, I agreed to the meeting, but with serious precautions. Ethan would be nearby, watching from a distance, and our private investigator would be positioned with a clear view of the entire area. The next day, wrapped tightly in a wool coat against the November chill, I sat on the designated bench overlooking the Hudson River. Exactly at 2 p.m., a figure in a hooded jacket approached and sat beside me. When they lowered the hood, I was absolutely shocked to see my mother's personal assistant, Greta, a woman who had worked for our family for over 20 years. "I don't have much time," she said, her German accent more pronounced than usual, clearly indicating extreme stress. "Your mother would fire me immediately if she knew I was here." "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Greta looked out at the churning water, her profile sharp against the gray sky. "I have respected your Grandpa Harold for many years. What your parents are doing, it's not right. I've watched, said nothing for too long." She handed me a small package, wrapped in plain brown paper. "Your mother's diaries. 3 of them, spanning 25 years. She thinks they're locked in her personal safe, but I've had copies of her keys for emergencies." She stood abruptly. "I was never here. You never saw me." Before I could even thank her, she was walking briskly away, disappearing among the other park visitors, a ghost in the crowd. The diaries proved to be absolutely explosive. My mother had meticulously documented years of financial manipulation, starting small, but growing increasingly brazen as my father gained more and more control of the company. There were chilling references to offshore accounts, falsified projections, and even instances of outright fraud in dealing with investors. But more painful, more sickening, were the casual references to me and my siblings. Ethan was dismissed as hopeless for business purposes. I was described as too principled for her own good, just like Harold. And Jillian? Jillian was characterized as perfectly malleable. "She'll sign whatever Richard puts in front of her as long as she gets her allowance and attention." When our attorneys presented the diaries in court, the judge immediately ordered forensic authentication. Once verified as undeniably genuine, they effectively demolished my parents' entire case. The evidence of long-term, deliberate financial crimes was utterly overwhelming. There was no coming back from this. Yet, even as we appeared to be winning the legal battle, a more disturbing reality emerged. Working with forensic accountants, we discovered that over $2 million was simply gone. Vanished. Transferred through so many shell companies and fronts that tracing it became nearly impossible. The money had effectively disappeared into the incredibly complex, shadowy web of international banking. After one particularly grueling day of financial investigation, I returned home, utterly exhausted, to find David waiting with a good bottle of wine and takeout from our favorite Italian restaurant. "You need a break," he said firmly, taking my briefcase and setting it aside. "Just one evening without Blake family drama." We were halfway through dinner when my phone rang. Seeing Ethan's number, I apologized. Ethan paused. "I think I should go. Maybe he's finally ready to explain himself. Or maybe he's trying to divide us," I countered, my voice sharp. "That's always been their strategy. Play us against each other." "I know, but—" Ethan sighed, a deep, weary sound. "He's still our father, Mandy. Biological or not. Don't you want to understand why he did all this?" The question hit me harder than I expected, a raw ache in my chest. Did I want to understand? Part of me wanted only justice, consequences, absolute closure. But another part, the daughter who had once adored her father despite his glaring flaws, desperately yearned for explanations that might somehow make sense of the profound, crushing betrayal. "If you go," I said, finally, my resolve firm, "I'm coming with you." The meeting, however, never happened. The very next morning, we received word that my father had boarded a private jet bound for a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. My mother, of course, claimed utter ignorance of his plans when questioned by authorities, though few believed her. The official investigation into Blake Holdings' finances was now moving from civil to criminal territory, with the FBI taking a direct and intense interest in the case. And in the midst of all this chaos, this wreckage, a small miracle occurred. During a routine doctor's appointment, I discovered I was 8 weeks pregnant. David and I had been trying for nearly a year, and the timing seemed both absolutely terrible and utterly perfect. New life, emerging from the ashes of family destruction. When I told Grandpa Harold the news, his eyes filled with tears, the first I'd seen since the whole ordeal began. "Life goes on," he said simply, his voice soft, placing his weathered hand over mine. "That's the beauty of it." 1 year. 1 year after the day Grandpa Harold stood up in that library and changed absolutely everything. We gathered again at Lakeview Manor, not for a reading, not for a legal proceeding, but for a different kind of family meeting. The grand house itself felt different now. We'd removed some of the more ostentatious, tasteless artwork my mother had favored and opened up rooms that had long been closed off, letting light flood into spaces that had been shadowed for years. My father remained abroad, reportedly living in a lavish villa in a country known for harboring wealthy fugitives. The FBI had frozen many of his known assets, but we all suspected he had meticulously planned his escape, with resources hidden where they couldn't be easily traced. My mother had negotiated a settlement with prosecutors, agreeing to cooperate in exchange for avoiding jail time. She now lived in a modest apartment in Boston, all pretense of social prominence utterly abandoned. But the most surprising transformation? That was Jillian. After initially siding with our parents, she had experienced what truly appeared to be a genuine crisis of conscience. When federal investigators showed her the actual documents she had signed, papers that implicated her in potential felonies, the chilling reality of her situation finally, truly penetrated the protective bubble our parents had so carefully constructed around her. "I didn't understand what I was doing," she told me, tearfully, during a difficult conversation 6 months earlier. "Dad always said it was just aggressive tax planning, that everyone in our position did the same things." "You're 30 years old, Jillian," I had responded, not unkindly, but firmly. "At some point, you have to take responsibility for your own choices." That conversation had marked the hesitant beginning of a tentative reconciliation. Jillian had entered therapy, moved out of the luxury apartment our parents had provided, and taken a legitimate position in the company's charitable foundation, work that seemed to genuinely engage her talents and interests for the first time. Now, as we sat around the dining table, Grandpa Harold at the head, with Ethan, Jillian, David, and me arranged around him, there was a quiet, cautious optimism. A feeling that would have been utterly unimaginable a year earlier. My son, Jacob, just 3 months old, slept peacefully in a bassinet beside my chair. His tiny, perfect presence was a constant, profound reminder of life's beautiful continuity, even amidst such upheaval. "I've asked you all here because I've made a decision about Lakeview Manor," Grandpa Harold announced, once we'd finished our meal, his voice calm, yet impactful. "I'm selling it." The statement, delivered without any preamble, completely stunned us all into silence. But this is the family home. Jillian protested, her voice laced with disbelief. It's been in the Blake family for 3 generations. Exactly, Grandpa nodded, his gaze firm. And it carries the heavy weight of 3 generations of secrets, of lies, and of unhappiness. This house shaped all of us, and not always for the better. He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on each of us, a quiet understanding. The Blake legacy isn't this house, or even the company, not truly. It's what we build together, moving forward. And I think we need fresh ground to build on. Over dessert, he unveiled architectural plans for 3 adjacent properties on a beautiful piece of land overlooking the same lake, but from the opposite, untouched shore. 3 homes. One for Grandpa Harold, one for David and me and our growing family, and one for Ethan, who had recently become engaged to a brilliant environmental lawyer he'd met through the company's sustainable development initiatives. What about me? Jillian asked quietly, her voice small, when she noticed there were only 3 homes planned. Grandpa Harold regarded her thoughtfully, a gentle, hopeful look in his eyes. That depends on you, Jillian. Your probationary period with the foundation ends next month. The reports I've received suggest you've truly found your calling there. If you choose to stay with the family and continue your current path, we'll build a 4th home. Or perhaps you'd prefer your own space elsewhere. The choice is yours. Jillian nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes, a genuine emotional moment. I'd like to stay close to Jacob, she whispered. I want to be a real aunt to him. Not the kind of aunt our mother was to our cousins, sending expensive gifts, but never really present. The business had stabilized beautifully under our joint leadership. Blake Holdings had weathered the scandal with remarkably little permanent damage, largely due to our absolute transparency with investors and partners about what had happened and the robust changes we had implemented to prevent similar issues in the future. We had downsized some operations, sold off properties that held painful associations, and truly refocused on the kind of community-oriented development that had been Grandpa Harold's original, passionate vision. Ethan had found this incredible, unexpected fulfillment in his business role. Though he still played music on weekends at a local jazz club, his true love never completely faded. David continued teaching, but had reduced his schedule to be more present for Jacob and to support me through the ongoing transitions. And me? I had discovered strengths I never even knew I possessed. An ability to make difficult decisions, to lead through crisis, to rebuild what had been so thoroughly broken. Later that evening, as we stood on the terrace overlooking the lake, Grandpa Harold and I watched the sunset paint the water in shades of golden crimson, a scene of incredible peace. Do you regret it? I asked him, my voice soft. Revealing everything? He considered the question for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on the cool, stone balustrade. Easier in the short term, perhaps, Amanda. But secrets don't disappear. They metastasize. Your father's dishonesty grew from the very soil of my own deception about his parentage. Your mother's manipulations flourished in the shadows we all agreed not to illuminate. He shook his head slowly. No, Amanda. Truth is always worth the pain it causes. He glanced back at the house, where David was showing Ethan how to properly hold baby Jacob, a new generation in safe hands. Besides, look what has emerged from the wreckage. Something authentic. Something with a foundation built on honesty rather than just appearances. The following spring, we broke ground on the new properties. The ceremony was simple, profoundly personal. Just the 5 of us and Jacob, now crawling and babbling excitedly. Jillian had, genuinely, earned her place back in the family circle. Her work with the foundation showed incredible promise, and her relationship with Ethan and me was slowly, carefully, healing. Grandpa Harold insisted we each turn a shovelful of earth, even Jacob, whose tiny hands I guided around the handle of a miniature shovel. New foundations, Grandpa said, watching his great-grandson with evident, profound joy. That's what matters in the end. As I look back on the incredible, tumultuous journey our family has taken, from betrayal to redemption, I can't help but wonder about your own experiences with family justice. Has karma ever delivered a perfect moment of truth in your family? Whether it was a dramatic confrontation like ours, or a quiet, internal realization, I'd truly love to hear your stories in the comments below. Family may be complicated, messy even, but as my grandfather taught me, truth is always worth fighting for, even when it hurts. Thank you for listening to my journey. Your support means everything as I continue building my new legacy based on honesty, rather than just appearances. Take care and good luck.